in this short lecture, I'm going to talk about normal versus inferior goods, and then also go into the concept of a Giffen good, which is a surprising but theoretically feasible result. So first, let me cover normal versus inferior good. A normal good is a good that when a person's income goes up, if that's the only change, their income goes up, they buy more of it. An inferior good is the opposite. If a person's income goes up, for inferior goods, they buy less of it. So in the last lecture, I used the example of Uber rides. That was an example of a normal good. When people become richer, they take relatively more Uber rides. Bus tickets are an example of an inferior good. If your income goes up, you might actually take fewer bus rides because instead of bus rides, you're now taking a more luxurious form of travel like an Uber, or I guess if it really goes up, like a private helicopter or something like that. Okay, so bus tickets are a good example of an inferior good. So I have a question for you before we go on. My question for you is that when the price of an inferior good falls, consumers buy less of it. True, false, or uncertain? So think about it for a second, and then I'll go over it. So your first guess is probably B, false. You would think that when price goes down, people don't buy less of it, they actually buy more of it, right? That's the basic assumption of downward sloping demand. As price goes down, demand goes up. But the answer, at least from a theoretical standpoint, is uncertain. And I am now going to explain why. I want to distinguish between typical inferior goods and a Giffen good. So for both of these cases, when the price of an inferior good falls, two things happen. One is the relative prices of the two goods changes. And we know from the substitution effect that's always going to cause them to shift towards consuming more of the good that just became relatively cheaper. So due to the substitution effect, when the price of, let's say, a bus ride falls, that's going to cause them to buy more bus rides. But the income effect can be in the opposite direction. When the price of bus rides falls, the consumer becomes relatively better off. That is, if they bought the same consumption basket as before, they'd have income left over that they could spend on other things, including more or less, more bus tickets or more of something else. For an inferior good, the fact that they are relatively better off means that they will buy less of the inferior good. So here, for inferior good, you have the substitution effect and the income effect operating in opposite dimensions. And so what happens overall, whether the total change is an increase in this inferior good or a decrease in the inferior good, depends on whether the substitution effect or the income effect is larger. Now, for a typical inferior good, which is almost all inferior goods, the substitution effect is larger in magnitude than the income effect. So overall, people still buy more of the good when the price falls, when the price goes down. But for a theoretical class of goods known as Giffen goods, the income effect is actually larger than the substitution effect. And so the overall impact on consumption after a price decline is negative. That is, when price falls, people overall buy less of it. So let me illustrate this graphically. So here we have sort of your starting scenario. Again, we have the quantity of good Y on the vertical axis, the quantity of good X on the horizontal axis. We have the budget line before any price change, and we have point B, which represents the optimal consumption basket, the point of tangency between the budget line and the highest indifference curve, which just touches that budget line. Then there's going to be a price decline in good X, which is the good we're going to assume is inferior in this example. And we can draw a hypothetical budget line, which has the same slope as the budget line after the price change, but is pushed down far enough towards the origin of this graph such that with this hypothetical budget line, they're just able to reach the same level of happiness, the same indifference curve as before the price change. Now, if you look at the change in consumption as you move from baskets B to C, that is the change due to the substitution effect. And unsurprisingly, it's causing them to shift more towards the good that just became relatively cheaper. Okay, now let's look at the income effect, and I'm going to draw this in a particular way to make the income effect very large. I'm going to assume that as you move from this blue budget line, which corresponds to a low income, to the red budget line, which reflects the same relative prices but a higher income. That is, a change as you move from the blue to the red line just reflects the income effect. I'm going to assume that that causes a very large change in consumption, actually a very large reduction in the quantity of good X consumed. So we can see here as you move from point C to A that the income effect is very large. Let's go through this again. So from B to C, that's a substitution effect. From C to A is the income effect. And the way that I've drawn this is that the income effect is larger than the substitution effect. And so the income effect causes them to buy less of it. Even though the price of good X has fallen, overall, this person is buying less of it. Okay, so it's sort of, this would imply actually upward sloping demand. When price of good X goes up, people buy more of it, which sounds very counterintuitive. But this example where we dug a little bit deeper shows that's theoretically possible. So where does this actually occur? There aren't really many shown instances, but the example that is often given is the potato famine. So the idea is that in Ireland, around the time of the potato famine, people were not particularly rich. In fact, they spent almost all of their income on food. And there were sort of two types of food that people ate, meat and potatoes. I know it's stereotypical, but this is the example that's always given. Okay, so there's meat and potatoes. The idea is that potatoes are the inferior good. People would rather eat meat than potatoes, but they often eat a good chunk of potatoes just because potatoes were relatively cheaper. So what happens during the potato famine? Suddenly there's a shortage of potatoes, which causes the price of potatoes to rise. We're going to assume that it rises somewhat, but it's still relatively cheaper than meat. Now, what happens here? Well, you would think that people would buy less potatoes as its price rises. But because of these rather severe income constraints, if they're going to be able to have enough calories to be fully nourished, they're actually going to have to shift to buying even more potatoes, which are the relatively cheaper form of food compared to meat. So even though the price has gone up, that's going to constrain their budget. They're going to have to buy even more of the good whose price has just gone up because that good is still the relatively cheaper type of food. And so it has been theorized, although I'm not sure it's been proven, that the potato famine illustrates an example where when the price goes up, people actually try to buy more of the good, where you have a Giffen good. So I'll stop there. We're going to go over a couple other examples in class that show why breaking consumption down into the income effect and the substitution effect can help us analyze a variety of economic problems in a deeper manner.